He didn't even look up from the papers. That's what Imara remembered most, not the attorneys, not the storm, hammering the glass, not the cold leather chair beneath her. Just Malcolm Rhee's hands, perfectly still, turning pages like he was reviewing a vendor contract. Like she was a vendor contract. 3 years of marriage. And the man who once told her she was the only person on earth who didn't bore him, couldn't spare her a single glance. The attorney slid the agreement toward her. "Miss Bennett, if you'll just—" "I know how to read," she said quietly. Malcolm finally looked up. His expression was exactly what she feared most, not anger, not guilt, nothing. That nothing almost broke her, right there at the table. Almost. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I wanted to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into part 1. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. Not delivered to their shared bedroom. Not placed on the kitchen counter over morning. Coffee slid across a conference table by a man in a charcoal suit who smelled like expensive aftershave and had clearly done this kind of thing dozens of times before. His hands were practiced. His expression was professional. He never once looked directly at Imara, which told her everything she needed to know about who had hired him. Malcolm Rhee's attorneys didn't look at people he had already decided to discard. Imara had dressed carefully that morning. She didn't know what was coming, not exactly, not yet. But she had learned early in her marriage that entering any room connected to Malcolm required armor. So she wore the dark blue dress he never complimented, the one that made her feel like herself rather than an accessory. She'd pressed it herself in the laundry room. At 6 in the morning, while the penthouse was still quiet, while the city below was just beginning to light up. She'd made her own coffee, too. Didn't wait for the housekeeper. Small habits. Small ways of remembering she still belonged to herself. She needed every single one of them when she sat down across from her husband and realized that the 2 attorneys between them were not there to discuss anything. They were there to document a conclusion Malcolm had already reached alone. The agreement was 63 pages long. She knew because she counted while she read, slowly, refusing to perform the panic rising somewhere behind her sternum. The terms were precise, almost surgical. Her personal bank accounts untouched. Her car returned. Her clothing, her grandmother's jewelry, her books, her photographs all carefully enumerated, all designated as hers. Everything else disappeared. The joint accounts, the investment portfolios Malcolm had suggested she be added to, the business credit card she'd used twice in 3 years, the apartment in New York they'd visited once gone, the security arrangement, the drivers, the network of quiet professionals who ensured that being connected to Malcolm Rhee meant never waiting in a line or sitting in an emergency room or being spoken to rudely by anyone who wanted to continue existing peacefully, all of it, gone within 48 hours of her signature. She read every page. Malcolm watched her read. She could feel it. She didn't look up. The rain had started, somewhere around page 12, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, with a sound like gravel being thrown by a frustrated hand. Chicago in November had a specific cruelty to it that other cities couldn't quite replicate, not just cold, but personally cold, like the weather had reviewed your file and decided you specifically deserved it. By page 40, Imara's jaw ached from holding it tight. By page 60, she had understood the message underneath the legal language. Not just what she was losing, but why the terms were arranged the way they were. Everything that tied her to Malcolm's world was being severed, but everything that had been hers before the evidence that she had existed independently before him was being handed back like proof, like he needed her to take it so that the record would show she had left with something. Malcolm Rhee was meticulous about records. She signed on the last page, set down the pen. Then she reached up, removed her wedding ring, a piece of jewelry she had never loved, but had worn with the steady faithfulness she brought to everything, and placed it beside his untouched glass of whiskey. He still said nothing. She stood, smoothed her dress, picked up the small bag she'd brought, and walked toward the elevator. He didn't follow. The elevator doors closed. She watched her own reflection in the polished metal upright, composed, the dark blue dress doing exactly what she'd needed it to do. The lobby took 45 seconds. The revolving door took 3, and then Chicago hit her like a fist. She walked. She didn't have a plan. She had barely had time to understand what had just happened before her body was already moving, the way it had moved her through every emergency she'd ever navigated, operating on some animal instinct below conscious thought. She walked through the rain without opening her umbrella because she couldn't remember which hand it was in. She walked past a cab she could have taken, past a coffee shop where the windows glowed warm and golden, and felt like something from a different species' life. 9 blocks. She made it 9 blocks before her legs stopped cooperating. She sat on the steps of a closed laundromat, gripped the metal railing with both hands, and held on while the shaking moved through her, in waves, not crying, not quite, just her body processing, something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. A woman in a yellow raincoat stepped around her on the sidewalk without slowing down. Nobody stopped. That somehow was the thing that steadied her, not kindness, its absence. The city had no idea who she was or what had just happened to her, and it was going to keep moving regardless, which meant she could too. She called her cousin Talia from the laundromat steps with rain in her face and a dead woman's voice. "Hey," Talia said immediately, not hello. Just hey, in the tone that meant she already knew something had broken. "Where are you?" Imara told her the intersection. "Don't move," Talia said. "I'm coming." Talia showed up in 17 minutes in a car that had a broken passenger side heater and a back seat full of her daughter's art supplies. She didn't ask any questions. She turned up the radio to cover the sound of Imara's breathing and drove her back to an apartment in Pilsen, where the couch had a floral slipcover and smelled like the coconut oil Talia used on her daughter's hair. "You can stay as long as you need," Talia said, handing her a towel. "Thank you," Imara said. "Don't thank me. Just eat something. There's leftover rice in the pot." She didn't eat. She lay on the floral couch and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a running fox. And she let the first night of her new life pass over her, like water over stone cold, relentless, indifferent to whether or not the stone survived. 3 weeks passed. She found a breakfast shift at a diner 7 blocks from Talia's apartment, 6 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. 5 days a week, tips pooled and divided. The work was hard in the specific way that service work was hard, which was not physically she had endurance, but psychologically. The requirement to be pleasant, patient, and invisible while someone spoke to you, like you were furniture, was something that had to be practiced or suppressed. And Imara was still deciding which approach to take. She was on her feet at the counter, refilling coffee, when the nausea hit. It wasn't the first time. She'd been dismissing it for a week's stress. She told herself, irregular meals, the cold. The body's registered suffering in 1,000 different ways, and this was just her body's chosen form of protest. But the nausea didn't pass. It got worse, fast, sudden, the kind that didn't negotiate. She made it to the bathroom in time. When she came back out, pale and gripping the counter, her coworker Denise handed her a glass of water and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had seen this particular look on a face before. "How late are you?" Denise asked. Imara started. Denise raised one eyebrow. Imara counted backward in her head, then counted again, because the first answer couldn't be right. She bought 2 tests from the pharmacy on her lunch break. Took them both in the bathroom of the gas station next door, because the pharmacy didn't have a single occupancy restroom, and she couldn't wait. Both positive. She sat on the lid of the toilet for a very long time. The thing about a moment like that, the thing no one ever tells you about receiving news that structures every plan you'd barely managed to make, is that it isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with music, or a swell of feeling, or sudden clarity. It arrives like everything else in a difficult life, quietly, in a fluorescent-lit gas station bathroom that smells like industrial cleaner, while someone outside is waiting for the stall. She had options. She understood that. She sat with all of them. She sat with Malcolm, the version of him she had married, before she understood what she had married into. The version who occasionally laughed at things she said with genuine surprise, like her being funny still caught him off guard after a year. She sat with the version who had watched her read 63 pages of legal dissolution, without offering her a single word, whose whiskey sat untouched while she signed her name over and over. She made her decision somewhere on the drive back to Talia's apartment, sitting in the back of a rideshare with her face turned toward the window. Malcolm would not know. This child, if she was brave enough, if she could figure out how to become brave enough, would not become a piece on his board, would not be used to renegotiate, to reclaim, to extend some invisible reach into a future Imara was only just beginning to sketch. She had watched how Malcolm moved things, people, assets, relationships with patience and precision and zero sentiment. She had watched him close a file on their marriage, with the efficiency of a man who had done it before and would do it again. She would not let him close a file on her child. She told Talia that night. Talia sat with it for a long moment, real silence, not theatrical pause, and then she said, "Okay, what do you need?" That was Talia. The question was always, what do you need? Not what are you going to do? Not are you sure? Not have you thought about? Just, what do you need? It was the most generous question a person could ask, and Imara had never been more grateful for it. "I need to figure out how to not fall apart," Imara said. "Part," Talia said. "I might. Then fall apart for tonight. Tomorrow we make a list." They made a list. The pregnancy progressed the way pregnancies do, with a total disregard for any life structure the woman carrying it had previously arranged. Imara left the diner at 4 months because her feet were swelling by 10 in the morning, and the manager, a man named Carl, who had opinions about everything, had begun making pointed comments about whether she was going to be a reliable employee going forward. She found a part-time bookkeeping position, remote, through a small catering company whose owner was a woman named Patricia, who hired her without a single comment about her situation. Patricia would matter later. Imara didn't know that yet. She kept her spending minimal in the way that people who have once had access to money and then lost it keep spending minimal, not with resentment, but with the grim efficiency of someone who has recalibrated their entire sense of what a dollar is. She ate well enough. She slept when she could. She let Talia's daughter, a 7-year-old named Kira, press her small ear against the growing roundness of Imara's middle and report that she could hear the baby thinking. "Thinking about what?" Imara asked. "Breakfast. Probably," Kira said seriously, and Imara laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her. The labor lasted 19 hours. She had planned to be stoic. She was not stoic. She was loud and frightened and furious, in the specific way that women in labor are sometimes furious, not at any one thing, but at everything, at the cumulative weight of every decision and circumstance and closed elevator door that had landed her in this hospital room, with no one holding her hand except a nurse named Dorothea, who called her baby and meant it kindly. And then it was over. And then there was a weight in her arms. The nurse said something. The doctor said something. Monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall, another baby was announcing itself. Imara looked at her daughter. Her daughter looked back. The eyes were steel gray. Not the dark brown Imara had somehow, without logic, anticipated. Gray, light, specific, unmistakable. Malcolm Rhee's eyes wearing the face of a person who had no idea yet that she was a miracle. Imara's throat closed entirely. She held on. Not to anything particular, just held. Fingers curled around the tiny, extraordinary weight of a person who had decided to exist, despite every obstacle arranged against her existence. She whispered one thing. Not a prayer, not a promise to the universe, just a single sentence spoken to the small face with the enormous gray eyes. "Nobody is going to put walls around you." She named her Mira, Myra Bennett. The certificate had a blank where the father's name would have gone. Imara left it blank. She brought Myra home, to Talia's apartment, on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, and Kira stood in the doorway in her school uniform, with the unbearable solemnity of a child who has been told to be gentle, holding a stuffed elephant she had decided to donate to the cause. "She can have Gerald," Kira announced. "Gerald is good with babies." Mira slept through the entire introduction. That first night, with Mira in the second-hand bassinet Talia had found and scrubbed clean and lined with the softest blanket she owned, Imara sat in the dark on the floral couch and let herself feel the full size of what she had just done. She was 29 years old. She had $42 in checking and a small amount in savings she was terrified to spend. She had no job that would accommodate a newborn schedule, no family other than Talia, and a daughter who had inherited her father's eyes and would no doubt eventually notice that they didn't match her mother's. She also had, though she didn't know this yet, a grandmother's handwritten recipe card tucked inside a hardcover copy of a novel she'd carried through every move, every packed bag, every closed elevator door. The recipe was for a yellow cake. Simple. Nothing architectural. Butter, eggs, vanilla, the kind of cake that didn't try to be anything other than what it was, something that tasted like care. Like someone had made it specifically for the person eating it. She didn't know yet that this cake would be the first stone in the foundation of everything she was going to build. But she would. The yellow cake happened by accident, the way most things that matter tend to happen. Talia's birthday fell on a Thursday in late October, 14 months after Mira was born, and Imara had exactly $12 and a near-empty pantry to work with. She had spent that morning on the phone with a staffing agency that kept putting her on hold, listening to the same 45 seconds of jazz loop while Mira slept in the next room, and the clock on the microwave told her she was already late for a cleaning shift she'd picked up through a neighbor's referral. She hung up before anyone answered. She didn't have time to stay on hold. She never had time anymore. That was the central fact of her existence in those months. The thing she fell asleep thinking about and woke up already behind on. Time. She found her grandmother's recipe card. While looking for something else, entirely a utility bill, she'd tucked into the back of a hardcover novel for safekeeping, which was the kind of organizational system that only makes sense when you're operating on 4 hours of sleep and making decisions in 3-second windows. Card was written in her grandmother's handwriting, which was the kind of handwriting old women had when they'd learned penmanship from someone who took it seriously, each letter deliberate, slightly ornate. The ink faded to a warm brown that made it look like a document from another century. Yellow butter cake. That was all it said at the top. Not grandma's cake or special occasion cake, just yellow butter cake. Plain and direct, like the woman who wrote it. She made it that afternoon between Mira's afternoon nap and the moment Talia got home from her shift at the dental office. She didn't have the right pan size, used a slightly wrong ratio of flour because she read a tablespoon as a teaspoon and had to add more, and the oven in Talia's apartment ran hot, so she pulled it 8 minutes early on instinct. It came out exactly right. Not perfect, there was a slight lean to one side, and the frosting she improvised from butter and powdered sugar was applied without much technique. But it tasted like something made by a person, for a person, with actual care. Talia ate 2 slices, standing at the counter in her work clothes, and said, "Imara, this is not normal cake. It's a normal cake. Normal cakes do not taste like this." Talia pointed with her fork. "What did you do?" "I followed the recipe." "Nobody who follows a recipe makes something that tastes like this." "You did something." Imara thought about it. "I think I needed it to be good, so I paid attention." Talia looked at her for a moment in the particular way that Talia sometimes looked at her, like she was calculating something, updating an internal estimate. "You should sell this." "I'm not selling cake, Talia. I'm not saying sell cake. I'm saying people pay for this. This thing you just did, this paying attention, people pay a lot of money for it, and usually don't even get it." Imara put the leftover cake in the refrigerator and didn't think about it again for 3 days. Then Mrs. Attawale, from the 3rd floor, knocked on the door. She was a small Nigerian woman in her 60s who wore her church clothes on Tuesdays, for reasons she'd never explained, and she had apparently smelled the cake through the building's ventilation system, which said something about Bone's ventilation system, and wanted to know if whoever had made it would make cupcakes for her granddaughter's birthday party. She would pay, she said, whatever the reasonable price was. Imara quoted a number she pulled from the air, $40 for 2 dozen cupcakes, and immediately thought it was too high. Mrs. Attawale said, "Fine, I'll need them by Saturday." She paid on delivery. Then she called her sister. Her sister called a friend. The friend was planning a baby shower, and the woman she'd hired for the dessert table had just canceled. Would Ms. Bennett be available? Ms. Bennett would be available. This was not a business plan. Let that be clear. Imara was not sitting at Talia's kitchen table at 11 at night drawing org charts and projecting revenue. She was a woman with a sleeping infant and 3 cleaning shifts a week and a binder full of job applications she sent out every Monday morning with the mechanical persistence of someone who had made a rule and was keeping it because the alternative was despair. The cake orders were money she could hold in her hand on the same day she earned it, which was a form of certainty she hadn't had in a long time. She took every order that came. She learned to bake in the margins during Mira's morning nap, during Talia's TV time at night, during the 2-hour window on Sunday mornings, when Kira took Mira outside in the stroller so Imara could have the kitchen. She started a notebook. Not a recipe book, a work notebook. Times, quantities, costs, client names, what they'd ordered, whether they'd reordered, what had gone wrong, and what she'd done to fix it. The notebook filled up faster than she expected. Mira turned 1, then 18 months, then 2. She was walking before most of the children in Talia's building, stomping around on legs that seemed to disagree with each other about direction, dragging a stuffed elephant named Gerald behind with absolute authority. She was stubborn in the way that small children are stubborn when they've inherited it from 2 directions simultaneously. And watching her, sometimes Imara felt something twist in her chest that she couldn't name precisely. Not grief, not longing. Something more complicated than either. Something that lived in the space between the gray eyes she hadn't expected and the determined set of a jaw that was entirely her own daughter's. She didn't talk to anyone about Malcolm. Not because the wound was too raw, it wasn't. Not after this long, not exactly, but because she had made a decision, and she intended to inhabit that decision completely. Talking about him would mean carving out space for him, in a life she was building specifically without him, and she didn't want to give him that real estate, even in conversation. The orders kept coming. Imara eventually rented 2 hours of commercial kitchen space on Tuesday and Thursday mornings from a small caterer on the north side, whose owner, a compact man named Felipe, who smelled permanently of cumin, was happy to take her money and largely leave her alone. She was efficient. She didn't make messes, she didn't clean. She showed up exactly when she said she would. Felipe eventually offered her 4 hours instead of 2, and charged her the same rate, which was his version of a compliment. It was in Felipe's kitchen that she met Reina Cole. Reina was 23, culinary school dropout. Dropped out because I learned everything they were actually going to teach me in the first year, and the second year was just paying for a piece of paper, who was doing freelance pastry work for 3 different caterers, simultaneously, and surviving on the exact kind of restless energy that either becomes something extraordinary or burns out entirely by 30. She showed up in Felipe's kitchen one Thursday morning, while Imara was working through a complicated tiered order for a corporate anniversary dinner, looked at what Imara was doing for about 90 seconds, and said, "Your fondant application is going to crack in transport, the temperature differential." Imara looked at her. "I'm not trying to be rude," Reina said. It's going to crack." "How would you do it?" Reina showed her. She was right. After that, they started talking. The talking eventually became Reina covering overflow orders when Imara was short on time, and the overflow became a standing arrangement. And the standing arrangement became, though neither of them named it explicitly, her almost 8-month partnership. Imara called the company Solenne. She'd been turning the name over for weeks before she settled on it. She wanted something that sounded like what the work actually felt like when she was doing it right. Quiet, precise, held. Her French was rudimentary at best, but the word had the quality she was after, and she thought it sounded like something worth trusting. She filed the paperwork herself, using a legal aid clinic that offered small business support to low-income entrepreneurs. The woman who helped her was a law student named Priya, who went through every line with her slowly, explaining each piece, and who said at the end of the appointment, "You've already been operating like a business. You just didn't have the paperwork." Is that good or bad? "Depends on what happens next," Priya said, which was not particularly comforting, but was probably honest. What happened next was a private dinner. Not a large event, 8 guests. A client referral through a woman Imara had made a retirement cake for, a wealth manager named Carla, who was hosting colleagues she needed to impress. The catering budget was twice anything Imara had previously been paid. The menu Carla described was specific, demanding, and had a 1-week lead time. Imara said yes, without calculating whether she could actually execute it. Then she went home, sat at the kitchen table, with Mira asleep, 3 feet away in the portable crib that occupied a third of the living room, and spent 4 hours figuring out how to execute it. She and Reina pulled it off. Not smoothly, Reina burned the first batch of glazed carrots, and they had to reconstruct the side dish from ingredients. Imara ran out to buy at 9 o'clock at night, and the main course plating took 12 minutes longer than the timeline allowed. And Imara had a moment in Carla's kitchens while waiting for the sauce to reduce where she thought, "This was a mistake. I have overcommitted. This is going to fall apart," in front of 8 people who know how to recognize when something falls apart. The sauce reduced perfectly. Carla sent a note 2 days later, handwritten, which told Imara something about her age and her intentions, saying that 3 of her guests had asked for Solenne's contact information, and she hoped Imara wouldn't be offended if she passed it along. She was not offended. 2 of those 3 guests became clients. The third was a man named Hess, who managed events for a mid-sized architecture firm, who hired Solenne for a quarterly dinner series that ran 3 times over the next year, and paid reliably and on time, which Imara had learned to value above almost every other quality in a client. This was how it grew, not with investors or a breakthrough moment or a lucky introduction to the right person at the right party. It grew the way things grow when someone tends them without stopping, even when nothing seems to be happening, slowly, root by root, in the dark, until one morning you look and something is standing there that wasn't there before. Mira turned 2 in August. In the apartment Imara had finally rented on her own, small, a 1-bedroom she'd converted into a 1.5 by putting up a curtain partition, so Mira had her own defined space, in a building that had a working boiler and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests within the week. It was not beautiful. The kitchen was the width of a galley on a boat, and the windows faced another building's wall. But it was hers. The lease had her name on it, only her name, and that still did something to her chest. Every time she thought about it. The party was small. Talia, Kira, Raina, 2 women from the building whose children Mira had apparently befriended through the complex toddler diplomacy of sharing crackers and showing each other interesting sticks. Imara made the yellow cake. Mira wore a paper crown Kira had decorated and spent 20 minutes being absolutely fascinated by the candle before Imara blew it out, at which point Mira looked personally betrayed. It was the best birthday party Imara had ever attended. She was standing at the kitchen sink, washing cake plates, when Talia appeared beside her with a dish towel and a look that meant something was coming. "I want to ask you something," Talia said. "Okay, and I want you to not get defensive before I finish the sentence." Imara handed her a wet plate. "That is a sentence designed to make a person defensive." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." Talia dried the plate, set it down, picked up another. "Do you think about telling him?" Imara kept washing. The water was too hot. She turned it down. "Sometimes," she said. And every time I think about it, I remember sitting across a conference table from 2 attorneys while he watched me like I was a line item. And then I stopped thinking about it." "She's going to ask," Talia said quietly. "Not now, but she will. I know. What are you going to say?" Imara turned off the water, dried her hands on the dish towel Talia was holding, watched through the doorway as Mira sat in the middle of the living room floor, gray eyes wide and serious, holding the paper crown and examining it with the focused intensity she brought to every object that interested her, completely absorbed, completely herself. "I'm going to tell her the truth," Imara said, "when she's ready for it. And I'm going to make sure that by the time she asks, she already knows exactly who she is without that answer." Talia didn't say anything for a moment. Then she handed back the dish towel. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The Havenport contract arrived 14 months later. It arrived as an email forwarded through a referral chain. Imara had to trace back 3 connections to understand a colleague of Hess who had recommended her to a partner at a PR firm, who had mentioned her to someone at Havenport Capital Group's administrative office, who was now sits across from Imara in a glass conference room on the 41st floor of a building that had a lobby larger than Imara's entire apartment. The meeting was with a woman named Kirst Vogel, who had the title of Senior Director of Corporate Relations and the energy of a person who made 17 decisions before 9 in the morning and was mildly annoyed when the people around her weren't keeping pace. She had Solenne's portfolio printed out and tabbed, which told Imara she'd looked at it before the meeting, which told Imara she was already interested, and the meeting was partly a formality. "We're looking at a 12-month contract," Christine said. "Executive dinners, investor receptions, 4 major events including our annual gala, full service menu, staffing, logistics, setup and breakdown." Imara had her notebook in front of her. She kept her face neutral. The number on the contract summary page was she had seen it when Christine slid the folder across, and she'd kept her eyes moving so Christine wouldn't see her register it at more than Solenne had made in its entire existence. We've used 3 different vendors for these events. Over the past 2 years, Christine continued, we keep running into the same problems: communication gaps, staffing inconsistencies, a fundamental inability to handle anything unexpected without it becoming a crisis. What kind of unexpected? Imara asked. Christine looked slightly surprised, as if she'd expected a pitch, not a question. Last April, one of our major investors arrived with a severe shellfish allergy that hadn't been communicated to the caterer. We had 3 courses with shellfish in some form. The caterer panicked, made it obvious. The investor noticed the panic before he noticed the shellfish. So the problem wasn't the allergy, Imara said. Exactly. Christine sat back slightly. Problem was the visible panic. In our world, the appearance of control is almost as important as actual control. Imara understood that world. She had lived adjacent to it for 3 years and learned its grammar even as she was being expelled from it. That's what Solenne does, Imara said. Not just execute the event. Absorb the problems before they reach the room. They talked for an hour and 15 minutes. Imara quoted a number. Christine countered. Imara held her number. Christine pushed again. Imara explained, calmly and specifically, why the number was the number: the staffing costs, the sourcing standards, the contingency infrastructures that made the shelf allergy scenario a non-event rather than a visible crisis. Christine agreed to the number. Before the contract was finalized, Imara told Reina. Reina sat down on a crate in the commercial kitchen and said nothing for almost 10 seconds, which was unusual for her. That's the whole next chapter, Reina finally said. That's what I think. Are you scared? Imara considered lying, decided against it. Yes. Good, Reina said. Last time you weren't scared going into something it was medium-sized. This one should be scary. Imara ran the ownership research 2 days before the contract signing. It was due diligence. She had learned to do it on every major client. A habit formed after an early event where she'd discovered midway through execution that the company she was working for was the subject of an active fraud investigation, and 2 of the guests were federal investigators attending the dinner undercover. She'd finished the event, delivered every course, broken down the tables, and then driven home and sat in her car in the parking lot of her building for 20 minutes before she could get her hands to stop shaking. After that, due diligence first, always. The Havenport ownership structure was complicated in the specific way that entities connected to significant private wealth were always complicated layers of holding companies, subsidiary relationships, investment vehicles with names that revealed nothing about their actual function. She followed it for 45 minutes with increasing attention, cross-referencing against a business registry database she paid $11 a month to access, tracing each parent entity up through its chain. The controlling parent was a private investment group. She looked up the investment group. She already knew the name of its principal director before she clicked the link. She knew it, the way you know something you've been half expecting. The way bad news sometimes arrives with the quality of confirmation rather than surprise. Malcolm Rhee. She closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it. She called no one. She sat in her kitchen with the contact at 2 in the morning, while Mira slept behind the curtain partition, and the refrigerator made its periodic sound, and the street outside had settled into the particular Chicago quiet that meant the bars had closed, and the next shift of the city hadn't started yet. She thought about walking away. She constructed the whole scenario, calling Christine Vogel in the morning, offering a professional explanation involving scheduling conflicts or capacity constraints, something clean that left no visible damage. She could do it. She'd walked away from harder things. She thought about what she'd built, what it had cost. The cleaning shifts before sunrise, the Tuesday and Thursday mornings in Felipe's kitchen, the night she'd run to a grocery store at 9 o'clock to replace burned carrots. The 4 years of incremental, unglamorous construction of something that now had the chance to become real in a way she had not allowed herself to fully imagine until someone put a number on a page that made it possible. She thought about Mira behind the curtain, sleeping with Gerald, the elephant tucked under one arm, a child who had inherited gray eyes from a man who didn't know she existed. She was not going to let Malcolm Rhee be the reason she didn't take this contract. She was not going to build the rest of her life around the outline of his presence, like a city planning its streets around a building that had already burned down. She signed. She showed up to the first Havenport pre-event meeting with Raina beside her, her presentation printed and tabbed, her pricing documents organized, and every singleton answer prepared for every question Christine might reasonably ask. The conference room had 12 people in it. She was setting up at the head of the table when the door opened, and she heard the room shift, not with words, just with the quality of attention that a room gives to a particular kind of person when they enter. And she knew before she looked up. She looked up. Malcolm stood in the doorway. He was wearing a charcoal suit. His hair was slightly different, shorter at the sides, more gray at the temple than she remembered. He had not gained weight. He had not softened at the edges. He looked exactly like a man who had spent the past 4 years being exactly who he always was, undisturbed by the consequences of his choices, which was probably because for 4 years the consequences had all been absorbed by someone else. He saw her. She watched it register, watched his expression do the thing she'd seen his expression do 100 times in 3 years of marriage, not change, exactly, but recalibrate. Like a machine that had just received new input and was processing its implications before deciding how to respond. Neither of them spoke for exactly 3 seconds. Then Imara looked back at her presentation materials, adjusted one page by a 1/4 inch, and said to the room, clearly and without tremor, "If everyone wants to take their seats, we can get started." She felt Malcolm move to a chair on the side of the room, rather than the head of the table. She felt his attention on her the way she'd always been able to feel it, like a change in air pressure, like the moment before weather. She gave her presentation. She gave it without looking at him directly. She answered Christine's questions. She addressed the room's concerns about timeline and staffing redundancies, and what the contingency protocol was for vendor failures. Within 24 hours of an event, she was specific. She was prepared. She was, by every observable measure, completely in control. When it ended, Christine said, "We'll be in touch about next steps," and people began gathering their things. Malcolm didn't move. She was packing her materials when she heard him cross the room, his footsteps unhurried, the particular cadence of a man who had never needed to rush, because rooms rearranged themselves around his schedule. Stopped 3 feet from her. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was exactly the same. She looked at him directly. Let him see that she was looking at him directly, that she was not afraid, that whatever it had cost her to stand in this room for the past 90 minutes and perform competence without flinching was already behind her, already paid and banked. "Mr. Rhee," she said, a pause. Something moved in his face, not regret, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that had the quality of a man who has arrived at an accounting and found the numbers are worse than he expected. "You built something," he said. She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than was comfortable. "Yes," she said. "I did." Then she picked up her bag, nodded once to Christine across the room, and walked to the door. She didn't look back, but she heard him, just before she reached the hallway. Not words, just the sound of him exhaling. Slow and controlled, the way he did when he was maintaining composure over something he hadn't anticipated. It was, she realized as she stepped into the elevator, the most honest sound she'd ever heard him make. The elevator descended. Raina stood beside her, saying nothing, which was how Imara knew Raina understood the gravity of what had just happened. At the lobby level, the doors opened. Raina looked at her. "Do you want to tell me who that was?" Imara looked straight ahead at the revolving glass door and the winter light beyond it. "Not yet," she said. "Okay," said Raina. He walked out. 2 days later, Imara was closing up the commercial kitchen just after 8 in the evening when her showed a notification, a security alert, from the camera she'd installed outside the kitchen door after a neighboring unit had been broken into. Motion detected. She opened the feed. The image was grainy and time-stamped and showed the corridor outside the kitchen. A man she didn't recognize stood at the far end of the hall, partially obscured, looking at something in his hand, a phone, or a notepad. He stood there for 40 seconds by the timestamp. Then he moved out of frame. She stared at the image. Then she called the one person she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, whose private number she had never deleted from her phone, despite making a conscious decision not to examine why. It rang twice. Malcolm answered on the second ring. No greeting, just, "I know." Her blood went cold. "What do you know?" she said. Pause that lasted long enough for her to understand. It was not a comfortable one for him either. "There's a man named Victor Zhang," Malcolm said, "and we need to talk." The wall she had spent 4 years building, the one between her life and his world, between Mira's future, and everything she'd spent 4 years protecting her from had just developed a crack. And from the other side of that crack, something was already looking in. She met him in a restaurant she chose herself. That detail mattered. She had learned in the years between that conference table and this one that the person who picks the location holds something, even when everything else is uncertain. So she chose a place in Logan Square where the tables were close together, and the lighting was bright, and there was always a midweek dinner crowd, a place where raised voices would be noticed, and where no one could disappear into shadows. She arrived 12 minutes early, took the table in the center of the room rather than the booth in the back, and ordered coffee she didn't want, so her hands had something to do. Malcolm arrived exactly on time. He didn't look around the restaurant. When he entered the way most people did that instinctive scan, checking the room, he looked directly at her, which meant he'd already had someone confirm she was there, which meant he'd had someone watching the entrance, which meant he was already operating, in a way she hadn't given him permission to operate. She filed that away. He sat down across from her without removing his coat. That told her something too. He wasn't planning to stay long, or he wanted her to think he wasn't, or he was cold. She had spent 3 years learning to read the grammar of Malcolm Rhee's small physical decisions, and she was surprised and irritated to discover that she still could. "Tell me about Victor Zhang," she said. No greeting. She didn't owe him one. Malcolm looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at things, was deciding how much to explain. She recognized that look. She used to find it frustrating, and now it made something cold move through her, because she no longer had any patience for the version of him that parceled out information by calibrated portions. "Victor runs an organization out of Detroit," he said. "We've been in indirect competition for 3 years. He's been trying to move into Chicago, specifically the financial sector relationships I maintain. He's been looking for leverage, and I'm leverage. You could be. If he believes there's a relationship he can exploit." "There is no relationship." Malcolm's jaw shifted, just slightly. "There's a child." The word landed differently than she expected. She had known, from the moment she saw the security camera footage and called him and heard his voice say, "I know," that this was coming, had spent 48 hours preparing for it. But preparation and arrival were different things. And for a moment, the restaurant noise fell away and she was sitting in a very particular kind of silence. "Say that again," she said, quietly. The way she said things when she needed the other person to understand, she was not asking them to repeat themselves. "I know about Mira," Malcolm said. "I found out." "How long?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand formatted as 2 words. He paused. 3 weeks. She absorbed that. 3 weeks of him knowing. 3 weeks of her going about her life, dropping off Mira at daycare, and working the Havenport contract, and thinking she still controlled the information. 3 weeks of that being a lie she was telling herself without knowing it. "Who else knows?" she said. "Dae-Hyun. No one else on my side." "And Victor?" "Victor's people found the birth record. They've been running a timeline. They haven't confirmed it yet, but they're close." He paused. "There was a man outside your kitchen 2 nights ago." "I know. I have cameras." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like adjustment, recalibration. He was updating his model of her in real time, and she could see him doing it, which was both satisfying and enraging. "He's one of Victor's," Malcolm said. "There's another one who's been stationed near a daycare on Fullerton." Coffee cup was in her hands. She set it down with more care than necessary, because the alternative was throwing it. "Near what daycare?" she said. "The one on Fullerton, and that is her daycare." Her voice was flat. "That is where my daughter goes every morning." The silence between them had a different quality now. Malcolm had been in rooms with armed men who wanted him dead, and she'd watched him sit through those situations with the stillness of something that had decided not to be afraid. Right now he looked, for the first time she could remember, actually uncomfortable. I know, he said. That's why I called you. She stood up. Not dramatically, there was nothing dramatic about it. She simply could not sit across from him while processing information that a man she had never met had positioned someone near the building where she dropped off her 2.5-year-old daughter. Every morning, a daughter who had gray eyes and a stuffed elephant and a complete inability to understand why the world contained any danger at all. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the street where ordinary adults were walking with their hands in their pockets and their breath making small clouds in the cold air. She made herself take 2 breaths, slow ones, the kind she'd learned to take when Mira was first born, and she was operating on broken sleep, and the situation required her to be functional before she was ready. Then she turned around and walked back to the table and sat down. Tell me everything, she said. Not the edited version. Not what you've decided I need to know. Everything. Malcolm told her. Victor Zhang had been building intelligence on Malcolm's Chicago operations for 18 months. His model of attack was not direct confrontation. Victor was, according to Malcolm, a man who preferred the precision of targeted pressure to the expense of open conflict. He looked for soft points. People who could be used, leveraged, removed from the board in ways that destabilize operations without triggering direct response. Victor's team had found Imara through the Havenport contract announcement, which had been publicized in a business journal brief, Solenne Private Hospitality, new vendor for Havenport Capital Group's executive events. That alone would have meant nothing. But Victor's intelligence operation was thorough, and no thorough meant going backward as well as forward. They'd pulled Imara's background, employment records, prior address history, hospital records from the public system. They found a birth certificate. Mira Bennett, father, blank. Born 8 months after Malcolm Rhee's divorce from Imara Bennett was finalized. Victor's people were not stupid. They did the arithmetic. What does he want? Imara said. He hasn't made contact yet. He's still in the intelligence phase. Malcolm's hands were flat on the table. But the way he operates, he'll make contact when he feels he has enough to make the conversation go one way. And what way is that? He'll approach you. Not threaten, not directly. He'll offer something. A business opportunity, maybe, or a warning about a manufactured risk to Solenne. Something that requires you to give him information about me in exchange. Small things at first, enough to make it feel manageable. And if I don't, Malcolm's eyes met hers. Then the child becomes the pressure point. She had known it was coming, that sentence, since the moment he'd said Victor Zhang's name. She had known it the way you know an impact is coming in the fraction of a second before it arrives. Knowing didn't make it land any softer. Her daughter who weighed 31 pounds and slept with a stuffed elephant and could spend 20 minutes examining a single interesting rock because the world was still full of things that deserved full attention. Her daughter with the gray eyes that looked nothing like her mother's. Leverage. No, Imara said. Malcolm looked at her. Imara, no. That is not how this goes. I am not moving my daughter into a compound. I am not surrounding her with armed men she doesn't know. I am not turning her childhood into. She stopped, restarted, lower. That is not what her life is going to look like. I promised her. She's 2. She doesn't know about the promise. I know about it. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing, calculating, the way he always calculated, building models of how situations moved from one state to another. Then, what do you want to do, he said, and that stopped her. Because in 3 years of marriage, Malcolm Rhee had never once asked her that question, had never framed a problem between them as one in which her answer was the variable that determined direction. He had informed, decided, arranged. He had occasionally consulted her about things adjacent to the actual decision, the way a person holds a meeting about details after the headline has already been resolved. What do you want to do? She looked at him across the table in the bright Logan Square restaurant and felt the strangeness of it, this specific man, with his flat hands and his recalibrating eyes and the gray at his temples that hadn't been there 4 years ago, asking her that question in this context, after everything that sat between them. I want Mira out of the city, she said. Somewhere he can't find her quickly. I have a client. She has a property upstate, remote. I've worked her estate twice. She'll say yes if I ask. And you trust her. I trust her more than I trust anyone connected to you. He accepted that without reacting. Talia goes with her? Yes, she paused. How did you know about Talia? I know about everything that touches your life, Imara. He said it without apology, which was almost more honest than an apology would have been. I've known for a while. I didn't use it. She held that information in her mind for a moment, the knowledge that he had known, had been watching at some level, and had chosen not to act on it. She wasn't sure whether that was restraint or strategy, or something she didn't have a word for yet. I want everything you have on Victor, she said. Every piece of intelligence. His people's locations, their communication patterns, everything Dae-Yoon has built. That's... He stopped. Everything, she said. Or I walk out of here right now and figure it out alone, which I will do, but it will take longer, and in the time it takes me, Mira is still exposed. A long pause. All right, he said. She called Talia from the restaurant parking lot while Malcolm was still inside. Talia answered on the first ring. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Imara said, and I need you not to ask questions until I finish. A beat. Okay. She explained it as quickly and completely as she could. Victor, the surveillance, the daycare, the need to leave the city within 24 hours. She kept her voice level. She was standing in a parking lot in November, and her breath was making clouds, and she was holding herself together through the specific effort of focusing on the next required action, rather than the full size of what was happening. Talia was quiet for 3 seconds when she finished. Kira has school, Talia said. I know, she has a science project due Friday. Talia. I'm saying yes, Talia said. I need a second to be angry about it first. Okay, I'm done. A breath. Tell me what to pack. Imara went home, packed a bag for Mira with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to pack quickly and well the right clothes. Gerald the elephant, the small board book Mira was currently obsessed with, the nightlight that had to come, because without it the wake-up at 2 in the morning was non-negotiable. She called her client, a woman named Frances Alderman, who had a property in southern Wisconsin, and the instincts of someone who had navigated several crises in her life without ever discussing them publicly. I need a favor, Imara said. Come tomorrow morning, Frances said, without asking what the favor was. East Wing is empty. Stay as long as you need. That was Frances. Imara's hands were steady the entire time she packed. She did not let them shake. She had promised herself, sitting on a laundromat step 4 years ago, that she was done being a person things happened to. She was going to be a person who happened to things. She was going to stay upright and moving and functional, regardless of what the situation required, because Mira needed her that way, and Mira was the only reason any of the rest of it mattered. The hands could shake later, in private, when there was time. She drove Mentalia to Frances's property herself the next morning, 4 hours up through Wisconsin in gray November light. Mira sat in her car seat and sang the same 6-second song on repeat for approximately 90 minutes, which she did when she was happy and comfortable, and which Imara listened to with a precision of attention she would have given to a symphony. Property was large and quiet and sat back from the road behind a tree line that made it invisible from the county highway. Frances met them at the door, showed them the east wing, pointed out where the nearest town was, and told Talia there was a chest freezer full of food in the utility room. My number is on the counter, Frances said to Imara. Call for anything. Then she left them to it. Imara put Mira down for a nap in the East Wing's small bedroom, in a bed that was too large but had good pillows, with Gerald positioned under her arm, and the nightlight plugged in, and the door cracked exactly the way Mira preferred it. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her daughter's chest rise and fall with the unconscious completeness of a child who does not yet know there are things to stay awake, worrying about. Then she went to the car, sat in the driver's seat, and let her hands shake for exactly 4 minutes. After that, she drove back to Chicago. She was in Dae-Yoon Kwan's office by 3 in the afternoon. She had seen Dae-Yoon a handful of times during her marriage. He was the kind of man who occupied these edges of rooms that Malcolm was at the center of, quiet in the specific way that people are quiet when they're absorbing everything rather than performing calm. He was Malcolm's chief strategist, his longest professional relationship, probably the person on earth who knew Malcolm Rhee most completely and had made a deliberate choice to remain beside him anyway. She had never fully decided what that said about Dae-Yoon. His office was on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that had the understated quality of genuine money rather than performed money, no artwork that announced itself, no furniture that was trying to impress. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall of windows. Dae-yoon was standing when she entered. He didn't seem surprised to see her, which told her. Malcolm had called ahead. "Ms. Bennett," he said. "I want to see everything," she said. "Everything on Victor's operation. The surveillance locations, the personnel, the communications, intercepts if you have them." Dae-yoon looked at her with the careful attention of a man deciding how much of what he was thinking to let surface. Malcolm said, "I don't want to know what Malcolm said. I want to know what you have." She sat down in one of the chairs without being offered it, which was not an accident. "You found my daughter. You found the birth certificate. You've been sitting on that information for how long?" Pause. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She absorbed that without letting it show. "And you told Malcolm 3 weeks ago, when the Victor situation escalated and the calculation changed." "What calculation?" Dae-yoon sat down slowly. He had the manner of a man who was used to being the one in the room, who understood things that other people didn't, and who was now encountering a situation in which that advantage was smaller than usual. "We knew Victor's people had found the birth record. We knew they were running the timeline. If the connection between Mira and Malcolm became something Victor could use, Malcolm needed to know. Before that," she said, "the 6 weeks before you told him, you knew. You didn't tell him." She tilted her head. Why? Something shifted in Dae-yoon's face. Just for a moment, a loosening, a brief access to something under the professional composure. "Because I wanted to understand what I was looking at first," he said quietly. "Before I handed it to him." She studied him. "You were protecting her. I was assessing the situation." "That's not what I said." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at him for a long moment. "I need the full Victor file. Not a summary. The file." Dae-yoon opened a desk drawer, took out a folder, and slid it across to her. It was thick. She opened it. The photographs made her stop. There were 8 of them. Surveillance quality grainy, taken from distance, time-stamped. 3 showed the commercial kitchen. 2 showed the street outside her apartment building. 1 showed the entrance of Mira's daycare from across the street, time-stamped 6:17 in the morning, when she usually arrived. And 2 showed Mira. In one, Mira was being lifted out of the car by Talia, wearing the red jacket she'd had since September. In the other, she was standing on the daycare steps, both hands on the railing, examining something on the ground. Her daughter. In surveillance photographs. In a file that had reached a man named Victor Jang who thought of her as leverage. Imara closed the folder. She sat very still for about 15 seconds. "Who took these?" she said. "Victor's operative. The one who was outside your kitchen. Where is he now?" "We relocated him last night. He's no longer in the city. And the one near the daycare. Also gone. Malcolm moved on it within 2 hours of your meeting." She nodded once. Her hands were on the folder on the desk, and she was pressing them down harder than necessary, which she became aware of, and stopped. "What's Victor's next move?" "He'll wait to see whether the pressure worked. When he sees that his surveillance positions have been burned, he'll understand that Malcolm has been informed. He might back off, or he might escalate, which is more likely." Dae-yoon considered this with the honesty of a man who wasn't going to offer her false comfort. "Escalate," he said. "Victor doesn't retreat when he loses an opening. He finds a different door. Then we need to close the doors," Imara said. She drove back to her apartment. She sat at her kitchen table and opened the Victor file again and read it completely. Every page, the intelligence reports, the personnel descriptions, the analysis of Victor's patterns, the timeline of his Chicago expansion attempts. She read with the same focused attention she brought to contracts and event logistics, looking for the thing that was true underneath the thing being said. Victor's operational model became clear as she read. Dae-yoon was right. He didn't attack frontally. He found the narrative that made an opponent look like something other than what they were, and then he made sure the right people saw that narrative. It was elegant, in a horrible way. The damage wasn't physical. It was reputational, relational, the kind of damage that severed connections and undermined trust, and left the target increasingly isolated without a single overt act they could point to. She understood, as she read, that the danger to Mira was not primarily physical. It was the threat of exposure of Victor, making the connection between Mira and Malcolm into a public's story, or a story told to specific audiences, in ways that would force either Malcolm to respond or Imara to react, either of which gave Victor exactly the kind of visible pressure point he was looking for. She put down the file. She picked up her phone and called Malcolm. He answered on the first ring. "The Havenport Gala," she said. "The one in 6 days." A pause. "What about it?" "I want to use it." Another pause longer. "Walk me through what you mean." She did. She laid out the logic, the way she laid out event logistics, from the first premise through every contingency to the final outcome. Malcolm was quiet the entire time she spoke, which was his version of paying full attention. When she finished, there was silence for a moment. "That could work," he said. "But it requires you to walk into a room where I run everything," she said. "Yes, I know what it requires." A pause. "And if Victor doesn't interpret it the way you're expecting," Malcolm said, "then we go to the contingency. But I think he will." She paused. "He's looking for the hidden thing." "If there's nothing hidden, there's nothing to leverage," Malcolm finished. "Exactly." A long silence. She could hear him breathing on the other end, slow, controlled, the careful respiration of a man who was sitting with something that cost him. "All right," he said. "Your event. Your terms." She put down the phone. She sat for a moment in the quiet apartment, with Mira's curtain partition 2 feet away, and Gerald's shadow visible through the gap at the bottom. Talia had left him behind by accident, and the city outside doing what the cities always did, moving without pause or apology or awareness of the specific weight one woman was carrying in one kitchen on one November night. Then she opened her laptop and started working on the event plan. 6 days, 150 guests. The largest event of her career, in the middle of the most dangerous 6 days of her life, with a man she had once loved and had decided not to forgive somewhere across the city, agreeing to enter a room where she held the power. She worked until 3 in the morning. When she finally stopped, her eyes burning and her coffee cold, and her notes covering 4 pages in handwriting that got smaller and more compressed as the night progressed, she sat back and looked at what she'd built. It was good. She hated how much she needed it to be. Because somewhere in a building she didn't know the address of, a man named Victor Zhang was also working, also planning, also looking at the calendar and the geography and the social architecture of a city that was about to host an event that could either close the trap on him or give him exactly the opening he was waiting for. And the difference between those two outcomes would come down to 6 days, a converted industrial venue, 150 people who had no idea they were attending anything other than a corporate dinner, and a woman in an emerald dress who had spent the last 4 years learning that the most powerful thing in any room was not the person making the most noise. It was the person who had already decided exactly what was going to happen before anyone else arrived. The 6 days felt like 6 different kinds of pressure applied to the same wound. Imara slept 4 hours the first night, 3 the second, and stopped tracking after that because the number was demoralizing, and she needed every functional hour she had. She worked the event plan in the mornings, ran logistics calls with Raina in the afternoons, fielded Havenport's administrative questions through Christine Vogel's assistant in the evenings, and spent the margins of every day monitoring 2 things simultaneously: the Victor file that Diane updated every 24 hours, and the security camera outside her commercial kitchen that she'd checked so many times the notification sound had started appearing in her dreams. Raina knew something was wrong by day 2. She didn't say it directly, that wasn't how Raina operated. Instead, she showed up an hour early to the kitchen, set up her station without being asked, and worked with the particular focused quiet of someone who had decided that the best support she could offer was competence rather than conversation. When Imara made an error on the 3rd morning, miscounted the serving quantities for the 4th course, a mistake she never made. The kind of mistake that happened when the brain was running hot. On too little sleep, Raina caught it, corrected the sheet, and placed it back on the counter without comment. Imara looked at the corrected sheet. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," Raina said. You want to talk about whatever this is?" "No." "Okay." Raina went back to her station. "The salmon needs another sourcing call. Felipe's supplier is short." That was it. That was all. And it was, somehow, Exactly what Imara needed, someone who understood that the most useful thing you could do for a person carrying something heavy was not to ask them to set it down and explain it, but to clear the path in front of them so they could keep moving. She hired 2 additional staff for the event, experienced servers she'd worked with before, people whose professionalism she'd verified through multiple events and who didn't require hand-holding or extensive direction. She briefed her entire team on Thursday morning, 2 days before the Saturday event, in the commercial kitchen with the full floor plan. Projected on a laptop screen she'd propped on a stack of equipment cases. She walked through every station, every timing sequence, every contingency. She did not mention Malcolm Rhee. She did not mention Victor Zhang. She described the event exactly as it appeared on paper, a high-stakes corporate dinner requiring maximum precision and zero visible disruption. And her team listened with the serious attention of people who understood that working for Solenne meant operating at a standard that didn't permit visible panic. When she finished, a server named Marcus raised his hand. What's the actual contingency if something goes wrong with the main course timing? Last corporate event I worked, the kitchen was 20 feet from the dining room. This venue, 80 feet and a freight elevator, Imara said, which is why we're running a secondary hot hold station on the venue's second floor. Reina will manage it. Every course leaves that station pre-plated, covered, and ready to move. We do not plate in the dining room. We arrive at the table complete. Marcus nodded. And if the elevator, stairs are 30 feet to the right of the elevator. We've mapped the route. We're running a rehearsal tomorrow afternoon. He didn't have more questions after that. That night, alone in her apartment with the Victor file open on the table and a cup of tea that had gone cold, Imara received a text from Dai Hyun. No greeting, just coordinates and a time. She stared at it. Then she typed back, "What is this?" His response took 40 seconds. Victor's man. Still in Chicago. Different location. Not a surveillance position. Stationary. She typed. Stationary means what? His response means he's waiting for instructions rather than gathering information. The posture has changed. She put the phone face down on the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed. Posture had changed, which meant Victor had made a decision, which meant the intelligence phase was over and something else was beginning. The gala was 40 hours away. She picked up the phone and called Malcolm. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "Is Miss R safe?" "I have a car on the property. Francis knows. Your daughter is fine." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It left her chest in a long, slow stream that felt like releasing pressure from some seals bit too long. What does Dai Hyun think? Victor is testing. He wants to see movement, whether we pull out of the event, change the security posture, show any visible reaction. If we move, he knows we're rattled. He'll press harder. So we don't move. We don't move. She was quiet for a moment. "Saturday has to work, Malcolm." A pause. "It will." "That's not an answer. I need you to tell me what happens if it doesn't." Another pause. Longer. "If it doesn't work, Victor makes contact. Probably with you first. He'll try to establish a direct channel before going to me. He'll offer something that sounds reasonable. A warning about a manufactured threat to Solenne, maybe, or information that seems protective. He'll frame it as doing you a favor, and then he'll ask for something in return. Small at first. Something that feels manageable. And if I refuse?" The pause this time had a different quality. She could hear Malcolm deciding how much of the truth was necessary. "He has the photographs, Imara." She didn't respond. "Not the surveillance photographs. His team took others. Of Mira specifically. In contexts that make the connection to me legible. The eyes, the way she holds things. He's had them analyzed." The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator made it sound. A car passed outside. "He was going to use a child," she said. "A 2-year-old. He was going to use the existence of a child. There's a difference. There is no difference." Her voice came out harder than she intended, and then she decided she didn't care that it was hard. There is no distance between using a child and using the fact of a child when the child is 2 years old and cannot protect herself and has never done anything to any of these people. Malcolm was quiet. "Saturday works," Imara said. "That's the only option I'm accepting." She hung up. She didn't sleep that night. Not really, she drifted, rose, checked the security camera, drifted again. woke to check her phone, lay in the gray pre-dawn dark, staring at the ceiling, and running through the event logistics like a system check, touching each component to confirm. It was still there, still solid, still something she controlled. At 4:30 in the morning, she got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a blank notepad and wrote down every single thing that could go wrong on Saturday. She filled 2 pages. Then she wrote, next to each item, what she would do if it happened. By 6 o'clock, she had filled 4 pages, and the coffee was gone, and the sky outside was beginning its slow gray lightning, and she felt, not calm exactly, but located. She knew where she stood. She knew what she was walking into. She had stopped pretending that control meant preventing all damage, and had returned to the definition of control she'd actually earned. Through 4 years of building something in difficult conditions, control meant knowing what you'd do when things broke, and being ready to do it without hesitation. The venue rehearsal on Friday afternoon ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. The converted industrial space in the West Loop had exposed brick and enormous industrial windows, and a ceiling height that did something particular to sound absorbed it in the right frequencies, left the room feeling intimate at 150 people in a way that smaller rooms sometimes failed to achieve. Imara had chosen it for that reason, and for the freight elevator that served the kitchen level, and for the loading access that allowed her team to arrive and set up without moving through the guest entrance. She walked every inch of it with her team. The staging areas, the service routes, the elevator timing, the positions of each server during each course, precise moment when house lights should dim and table candles should be confirmed lit, the location of every fire exit, every electrical panel, every switch that controlled the room's ambient system. Marcus ran the elevator drill 4 times until the timing was exactly what she needed. Raina stood at the secondary hot hold station on the 2nd floor and watched Imara time the descent with a stopwatch expression. "We're 8 seconds over on the fish course," Raina said. "I know. We're going to pre-position on the landing rather than waiting for the elevator to arrive. That means someone has to be on the landing the whole time. You're on the landing for the fish course. I'll cover the station." Raina wrote it down. "And if the elevator sticks?" "It stuck once during setup. We go to stairs. I'll call it over radio. 30 seconds from call to table if everyone is in position." Imara looked at her. "Everyone will be in position." Raina looked back at her steadily. "Okay," she said. "Okay." That evening, with the venue locked and her team dispersed until Saturday morning, Imara drove to a parking lot near the lakefront and sat in her car and called Francis's number. Francis answered. In the background faintly, Imara could hear Kira's voice, and then Talia saying something quiet, and then there, underneath it, unmistakable Mira's 6-second song. The one she sang when she was happy and comfortable. The 31 pounds certainty that the world contained nothing to stay awake worrying about. She listened to it for as long as she could without saying anything. "She's good," Francis said softly. "Kira taught her to identify 3 different bird species this afternoon. She's very serious about it." "That sounds right," Imara said. Her voice was steady. She was very tired. "You're going to be all right," Francis said, not as a question. As a statement of fact, in the tone of a woman who had watched a great many situations and developed a reliable sense of which ones resolved and which ones didn't. "I know," Imara said. "Call me when it's over, I will." Saturday arrived. The sky was the specific November gray that Chicago did better than anywhere heavy and low and somehow entirely neutral, as if the weather had decided to take the day off from having opinions. The temperature was 31 degrees at 6 in the morning when Imara arrived at the venue with Raina and the first 2 staff members to begin setup. She was wearing her work clothes, black trousers, a plain dark top, practical shoes. The emerald dress was in a garment bag in her car. She would change at 7:30, 1 hour before doors, after the room was set and the kitchen was running and every detail had been confirmed by her own eyes. Setup took 4 hours. She moved through it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every motion and was now simply executing the plan she'd already made, directing the linen placement, confirming the floral arrangement, positioning with the florist, who arrived at 8, checking the candle placement against the floor plan she'd drawn herself, testing the room's ambient lighting at 3 different settings until she found the exact warmth that made the exposed brick feel intentional rather than industrial. At 11 o'clock, Daehyun called. 2 of Victor's people are in the city, he said. Different from the ones we burned. Clean faces, no prior connection to his known operation. Her hand tightened on the phone. Locations. Moving. Not stationary. They're not in surveillance positions. Then what positions are they in? Attendance positions. She understood immediately. He has people coming to the event. 2 guests on the confirmed list that have import added in the last 48 hours. The firm recommendation. On paper, they're legitimate associates from a consulting group Victor uses as a front for legitimate relationships. How confident are you? Confident enough to call you. A pause. They're not going to do anything physical, Imara. That's not Victor's method. They're going to observe. Report back. Possibly make contact with you directly during the event. And if they make contact, you handle it exactly as planned. Nothing changes. She was standing in the middle of the room with 150 place settings arranged around her and candles not yet lit and afternoon light coming through the industrial windows in flat gray sheets and Dae-Hyun's voice in her ear telling her that 2 of Victor Jang's people were going to walk into her event tonight and sit down at her tables and eat her food. All right, she said, send me their names. 2 seconds later, 2 names, 2 photographs. She memorized the faces in 30 seconds, the way she memorized floor plans and service sequences, not by effort, but by the repetitive pressure of absolute necessity. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. At 7:30, she changed into the emerald dress in the venue's small back office, using a compact mirror and the overhead light that was slightly too yellow. She did her own makeup. Her hands were steady. She looked at herself in the small mirror not for long, not to assess whether she looked good enough, but to confirm that the person looking back was ready. She was ready. The first guests arrived at 8. She was at the entrance of the room when they began filing in, not standing in the doorway, in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but present, visible, available, the person whose attention moved over every detail of the room, with the quiet authority of someone who understood everything about what was happening and had arranged all of it intentionally. She identified Victor's 2 men within the first 15 minutes. They arrived together, separated immediately upon entering good training. She registered, which told her something unpleasant about the kind of operation Victor ran. They moved to different areas of the room, made separate introductions, did nothing that would draw attention. If she hadn't memorized the photographs, she wouldn't have noticed them. She noticed them. She positioned Marcus near the one closer to the room's center. She took the one near the window side herself, moving through the room in the natural pattern of a hospitality director, ensuring the evening's comfort, passing close enough to the man 3 times in the first 40 minutes to confirm the photograph match and observe his behavior. He was watching Malcolm's chair, empty still, at 8:45, because Malcolm always arrived at the precise moment that was neither early nor late, the moment that said I was not waiting, but I am here now. He arrived at 8:52. The room responded the way rooms responded to Malcolm Rhee, without understanding why. Not a sudden silence, not a dramatic pause, just a slight shift in the ambient energy, the way light changes when something moves in front of a source. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the kind of understated appearance that was its own form of statement. He shook 3 hands in the first 90 seconds. He was steered toward his assigned seat by Christine Vogel's assistant. Imara watched him find his seat, unfold his napkin, and settle in without once looking directly toward the kitchen. She went to the kitchen. The first course went out at 9:07, exactly on time. The room became what she had planned for it to become: warm, contained the particular quality of a well-run event where the guests felt held without feeling managed. Conversations lifted and fell at the tables. Wine was poured and not immediately emptied, which told her the pace was right. Laughter happened organically at 2 different tables in the first 30 minutes, which told her the ambient sound design was working. She moved. She always moved during events, not frantically, but with the continuous low-level presence of someone for whom stillness during service was a form of negligence. She checked the timing on the second course, confirmed the elevator was clear, verified with Marcus via earpiece that the room temperature was holding. It was during the second course that Victor's man near the window moved. Not dramatically, just a shift in chair angle, a slight lean toward the guest beside him. Imara was 40 feet away and watching, and she saw the guest he was speaking to glance involuntarily toward the front of the room. Toward Malcolm. She was moving before she'd consciously made the decision. Through the room, smoothly, at the pace of a professional checking on a table rather than crossing to intercept something. She arrived at the table, smiled at the assembled guests, inquired about the course, was everything to their satisfaction. Did anyone need anything adjusted? And in the process of leaning slightly to address the guest on the far side, she placed herself directly in the sight line between Victor's man and Malcolm's table. The man looked up at her. She met his eyes, held them for exactly 1 second. Not threatening, not confrontational. Just, I see you, and I know what you are, and this is my room. Then she smiled at the rest of the table and moved on. Her earpiece crackled. Daeyeon's voice. From somewhere in the building, he'd been positioned in the venue's secondary office since 7. Good, second one is stationary, not making contact. She pressed the earpiece confirm without speaking. The third course went out at 9:51, 12 seconds early, which she filed as acceptable rather than good, and would discuss with Reina in the debrief. Malcolm took the stage at 10:15. She didn't plan to watch. She had the fish course to manage, and a timing sequence that required her physical presence in the kitchen corridor for the next 11 minutes. And watching Malcolm give a speech was not part of the operational plan she'd built over 6 days. But the room got quiet in a specific way when he began speaking, the kind of quiet that happens when a room of people simultaneously decides that what's being said matters. And she found herself stopping in the corridor, one hand on the wall, listening. His voice carried without effort, the way it always had. Not loud, just present. She had watched him command rooms for 3 years, and she understood, intellectually, how he did it, the pacing, the specific use of silence, the way he made every person feel like the eye contact was directed at them individually. She understood the mechanics. It didn't make it less effective. He spoke about Havenport's philosophy of investment. He spoke about what it meant to identify value before it was legible to the market. He spoke about the discipline required to see something in its early stages and commit to it without the comfort of consensus. And then he said Solenne's name. She heard it from the corridor. She heard him tell 150 investors and executives that what Solenne Private Hospitality had created was something his organization had not managed to create internally despite resources that dwarfed anything available to an independent company. The instinct to recognize what a room needed and provide it before anyone thought to ask. He said the name of Solenne's founder, Imara Bennett. He said that she understood what it meant to build something worth standing behind. The applause rose. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and looked at Linsing for approximately 3 seconds. Then her earpiece crackled. Reina, fish course is ready. You need to call it. Call it, she said. Go. She moved. The fish course hit the tables at 10:22, 11 seconds under the target timing, which was as close to perfect as imperfect conditions allowed. She was at the service station when Marcus appeared at her elbow, low voice, controlled. Victor's man near the window is getting up. Which direction? Moving toward the back of the room. Not the exit. The bar area, she said. Yes. She handed the station clipboard to the server beside her. Hold the dessert timing. Tell Reina 2 minutes. She moved. The bar area was a semi-separated space at the back of the main room, slightly dim, the place where guests drifted when they wanted a quieter conversation. It was occupied by 4 people when she rounded the corner, 2 guests in conversation, a bartender she'd hired, and Victor's man, who was standing with a drink he wasn't consuming, looking at his phone. She approached the bartender, asked, quietly, about the wine inventory for the dessert pairing. A legitimate question, loudly enough to be heard, taking 30 seconds longer than necessary, during which time she remained in the bar area, with her back partly to Victor's man and her attention entirely on him. He put the phone to his ear. She heard, clearly enough, she's not connected to him. Contract. It's exactly what it looks like. Pause, listening. The speech was public positioning. He's reframing her as a vendor. Another pause. I don't think there's a play here. Another pause. And then his voice dropped lower, and she lost the words. She thanked the bartender and moved back into the main room. Her earpiece, Daehyun. Did you hear it? Yes. The The second one has been on his phone for 4 minutes. Same call, probably. Victor is recalculating, she said. Victor is losing his narrative, Daehan said. You just made it too expensive. She pressed the confirm and walked back to the service corridor and leaned against the wall for 3 seconds, because 3 seconds was all she could afford, and her legs were doing something. Not exactly. Just operating with slightly less certainty than she required them to. She pushed off the wall. Dessert, she said into the earpiece. Call it. Full sequence. The rest of the evening moved in the compressed way that high-pressure events always moved in their final hour's time, behaving strangely. Moments stretching and contracting according to their importance rather than their actual duration. The dessert course went out. The table settings were cleared in the sequence she'd drilled. The final wine pairing was poured. Guests began the natural drift toward coats and conversations near exits. By 11:45, the room was thinning. Victor's 2 men left within 10 minutes of each other. Neither made direct contact with her. Neither spoke to Malcolm. She stood near the darkened windows at the far edge of the room, watching the last guests gather their things, and she let herself, for the first time in 6 days, take a breath that was not also a calculation. The room was hers. The evening was hers. It had worked. She heard footsteps and didn't need to look to know whose they were. Malcolm stopped a few feet away. Not close. The right distance for 2 people who had not yet negotiated what distance was appropriate. She looked at him. He looked back. It worked, he said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. The last of the guests' voices faded into the corridor, and the room was suddenly very large and very quiet around the 2 of them, and the space between them that contained 4 years, and a child with gray eyes, and 63 pages of legal dissolution, and a yellow cake, and a company called Solenne, and everything that had been built from wreckage without his knowledge or his help. Daehyun confirmed, Malcolm said quietly. Victor's people reported back. He's standing down. The operation against you is over. She nodded once. Mira is safe, he said. Yes. He looked at her with the expression she had seen form on his face in the Logan Square restaurant, the one that was adjacent to regret, but more specific. The accounting expression, the one that appeared when a man who was accustomed to controlling outcomes was forced to sit with one he hadn't been able to calculate his way around. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I drove to your building, he said. 7 weeks ago. Before I told you, I knew. I sat outside and I watched the exterior landing. He paused. She came outside. Small red jacket. She was holding the railing with both hands. Imara was very still. I watched her for less than a minute, Malcolm said. I didn't approach. I wouldn't. He stopped. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was deciding how much of something to let through. I just needed to see. And what did you see, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and for a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most composed person in any room he entered, what crossed his face then was remarkably unguarded. I saw what I did, he said, clearly, for the first time without anything between me and it. His voice was controlled, but just barely. You were pregnant when I handed you those papers. You were carrying her. And I... Stop, she said. He stopped. She looked at him. At the gray temples and the flat hands, and the man who had discarded her with the precision of closing a file, and who had then watched their daughter grip a railing exactly the way he did and had driven home, carrying something he hadn't been able to put down since. She didn't forgive him. Let that be absolutely clear, not to Malcolm, not to herself, not to the quiet room around them. Forgiveness was not a thing that happened in a venue at 11:50, on a Saturday night 6 days after discovering your daughter was in surveillance photographs. Forgiveness was a slow thing, a private thing, the kind of thing that required time she hadn't had yet. But she had something to say, and she was going to say it. I don't forgive you, she said. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. She held his gaze. But I'm not going to use her against you either. She is not a punishment. She is not leverage. She is a person. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He nodded. If you want to know her, Imara said, you will earn it. Not with money, not with security arrangements, or trust funds, or the weight of your name. You will show up when you say you will. You will remember what she tells you. You will be reliable on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody is watching and there is nothing impressive about it. She paused. That is the only version of this I will allow. I understand, Malcolm said. I'm giving you 30 days, she said, to prove that the man making those promises still exists when nobody is around to confirm it. He looked at her for a long moment. 30 days, he said. She held his gaze for one more beat, then looked past him at the room she had built from empty space, and 6 days of preparation, and 4 years of everything that had come before, the room that was hers, in a way no room had ever been before. And she felt something shift in her chest, not resolution, not relief, but something stubborn and specific. She was still standing. Everything in this room had come from her hands, and she was still standing inside it. And her daughter was safe in a farmhouse in Wisconsin, singing a 6-second song, and the man who had once handed her 63 pages of legal abandonment was standing in front of her, asking for 30 days. She reached past him and straightened a water glass that had shifted slightly on the nearest table. "Go home, Malcolm," she said. He went. She stood alone in the room for a long moment after the last sound of him faded. Then Raina appeared in the kitchen doorway with her jacket already on, and a look on her face that said she had been waiting with the patience of a person who understood that some moments needed to finish before the work of cleaning up could begin. "We good?" Raina said. Imara looked at her. "We're good," she said. Raina nodded once. "Then let's break this down. I want to be home before 2. And Imara, who had spent 6 days preparing for a night that had asked everything of her and given nothing easily, turned back to the work of her own hands and began to. The breakdown took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Imara worked the entire time not because she needed to, not because her contract required it, but because there was something specific and necessary about the act of dismantling the thing she had built with her own hands after using it for exactly what it was intended for. She folded linens. She directed the equipment load-out. She walked the room 3 times after the tables were cleared, checking the floor for anything left behind, confirming the venue was returned to the condition she'd found it in, which was a professional standard, but also tonight, something more personal than that. This room had asked everything of her. She wanted to leave it clean. Raina handled the kitchen breakdown with Marcus, while Imara managed the venue floor, and they worked in the companionable quiet of people who were too tired for conversation and too professional to let the tiredness show in the work. At 1:40 in the morning, the last equipment case went onto the truck, and Imara stood on the sidewalk outside the venue in 30-degree air without her coat because she'd forgotten it on a chair inside and was too tired to go back for it immediately. Cold felt clarifying rather than uncomfortable, like something she'd earned. Marcus appeared beside her with the coat. He handed it over without comment. She put it on. "Good event," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." He nodded once, the way people nodded when they meant more than they were saying, and walked to his car. Raina came out last, pulling the venue door closed behind her and testing it twice to confirm the lock. She stood beside Imara on the sidewalk and looked at the street, which was empty in the way that Chicago streets were empty at 2 in the morning in November, not abandoned, just resting, holding its breath between the bars closing and the delivery truck starting. "You want to tell me now?" Raina said. Imara looked at her. "About whatever tonight actually was," Raina said. "Because I've worked 7 events with you, and I've never seen you check the same corridor 3 times in one evening. And I've never seen a guest speaker use their entire platform to publicly name your company when you were supposed to be an anonymous vendor." She paused. "And I've never seen you look at anyone the way you looked at the man who did that." Imara was quiet for a moment. The city breathed around them. "He's Mira's father," she said. Raina didn't react immediately. She absorbed it the way she absorbed most things completely, without performance. Then she said, "Does he know?" "He knows now." Another pause. Is that okay? For Mira?" Imara looked at the empty street. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think it could be, if he earns it." She paused. "I gave him 30 days. 30 days to do what? To prove he's a person she can rely on." Raina thought about this. "And if he doesn't, then we go on exactly the way we've been going." Imara pulled her coat tighter. "We've been fine. You've been more than fine," Raina said, with the directness that was her specific form of loyalty. "But fine isn't the same as everything you could have." Imara looked at her for a moment. "When did you get wise?" "I've always been wise. You've just been too busy to notice." Raina picked up her bag. "Go get your daughter." I'll handle the client debrief with Christine on Monday. I can handle the Imara. Reina looked at her with the patient firmness of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be talked out of it. Go get your daughter. She drove to Wisconsin in the dark. 4 hours north, through the sleeping interstate, the highway mostly empty, the flat Illinois landscape, giving way to the gentler topography of southern Wisconsin without drama or announcement. She had the heat on and the radio low, and she was running on the specific fuel that extreme tiredness sometimes produced, not energy, not exactly, but a strange clear-headedness, a simplification of everything, down to the next necessary action. She reached Francis's property at 6 in the morning. The sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges, gray becoming slightly less gray in the east, the tree line along the property's edge becoming visible in silhouette. Francis met her at the door in a robe, holding a mug. She's still asleep, Francis said quietly. Both of them are. I know. I just needed to. She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. I know, Francis said. She stepped back from the door. Come in. There's coffee. She sat in Francis's kitchen and drank coffee while the house woke up around her slowly. She heard Kira first, the particular low-level noise of a child who was awake but hadn't yet committed to it, moving around in the bedroom above, with the shuffling half-consciousness of someone who was deciding whether morning was worth engaging with. Then Talia's voice, quiet, and Kira's response, and then silence again. Then, from down the hall, the 6-second song. Imara set down her mug. She walked down the hall to the east wing bedroom and pushed the door open slowly, the way she always did slowly, with enough warning that the room's occupant wasn't startled. Mira was awake in the too-large bed, sitting upright against the headboard, with Gerald the elephant wedged under one arm and a board book open on her lap that she was examining with the focused intensity she brought to everything. The nightlight was still on, casting its small warm circle on the wall. Mira looked up. She looked at her mother for exactly 2 seconds, with the specific expression she wore when she was processing something, the slight narrowing, tilted head, and then her face broke into the kind of smile that small children produced when someone they loved appeared unexpectedly, the kind that involved the whole body that had no performance in it at all. Mama, she said, with the complete satisfaction of a person whose world had just been corrected. Imara crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and gathered her daughter against her chest, Gerald and board book and all, and held on. Mira submitted to this for approximately 30 seconds and then began squirming in the purposeful way that meant she had things to report. Kira teached me birds, she said into Imara's shoulder. Taught, Imara said automatically. There was a red one and a gray one, and one that Kira says is a nuthatch, but I think she said it wrong. Probably said it right. It's a funny word, Mira said firmly. It's a funny word, Imara agreed. She held her daughter for another moment, her chin on top of Mira's head, looking at the small warm room with its nightlight and its too-large bed, and the board book splayed on the blanket, and she let herself, quietly and privately, feel the full weight of what the past 6 days had been, not to wallow in it, not to revisit it with the intention of suffering, just to acknowledge it, the way you acknowledged a distance you'd traveled not to go back, but so that you understood where you were now in relation to where you'd been. She had kept her daughter safe. Everything else was built from that. She drove home to Chicago that afternoon. Mira sang the 6-second song for 90 miles and then fell asleep with her cheek on Gerald's head and one hand pressed against the cold of the car window, and Imara drove through the familiar flat middle distance of the Illinois landscape with the particular quiet satisfaction of who had come through something of a person through something and was still in possession of everything that mattered. The 30 days began without ceremony. Malcolm called on day 3 not to ask for an update or to negotiate terms or to deliver anything, just to ask what Mira's current interests were. He said it plainly, without preamble. I want to know what she's into right now, what she pays attention to. Imara was in the commercial kitchen. She set down what she was doing. Birds, she said. She learned to identify 3 species last that week. She's been asking about them since. Okay, Malcolm said. Stars, Imara added. She asks about stars. She's noticed they're not all the same brightness. Okay, he said again. And she has a stick she uses to measure things. A Y-shaped one she found in the park in October. She carries it everywhere. Pause. What does she measure everything? Nothing specifically. She holds it up to something and says she knows how big it is and then moves on. I've stopped trying to understand the system. There was a brief silence on the line that had something in it she didn't quite have a word for. All right, he said. Thank you. He hung up. Day 7, he called Dae-hyun. She learned this from Dae-hyun himself, who mentioned it in a brief follow-up call about the Victor situation's final resolution. Malcolm had asked Dae-hyun to recommend a children's astronomy book appropriate for a toddler. Dae-hyun had apparently spent 40 minutes researching this and had provided 3 options, which Imara found, coming from Dae-hyun, both absurd and oddly touching. The Victor situation resolved with the flatness that most dangerous situations resolved not dramatically, but with the quiet deflation of a threat that had lost its structural support. Without a viable narrative to exploit, without a surveillance operation to sustain, and with the awareness that Malcolm had identified his Chicago personnel and could expose the entire intelligence network. If Victor pushed further, the calculation shifted. Victor withdrew. Not gracefully, there was reportedly a redirected business move in the Detroit market that Dae-hyun interpreted as face-saving, but completely. Imara never heard from Victor Jang directly. She was glad. She had prepared for the possibility and was glad not to need the preparation. Christine Vogel called on Monday morning as promised, and the debrief was professional and warm, and ended with Christine asking whether Solenne would be interested in a contract extension through the following year's event cycle. Imara said she would have a proposal ready by Thursday. She had it ready by Wednesday. The weeks following the gala had a quality she hadn't expected, not relief, exactly, which she'd anticipated, but something quieter and more complicated. Kind of recalibration. The sustained high-pressure state of the previous 3 weeks had occupied so much of her internal space that its absence left room for things she'd been too busy to feel, and some of those things were uncomfortable. She thought about Malcolm more than she wanted to. Not in the way she had once thought about him, not with the particular grief of a person processing the loss of someone they had loved, which was what the first year after the divorce had contained, though she had never named it clearly to herself. More like the renegotiation of a fact. He existed. He knew about Mira. He was, for the first time in 4 years, an active element of the situation, rather than a closed chapter she'd written around. She was not ready to forgive him. She had said so clearly, and she meant it clearly, and she was not going to perform a forgiveness she hadn't actually arrived at, just because the crisis was over and the pressure had released. But she admitted to herself on a gray Wednesday morning while Mira ate cereal and identified the bird she could see from the kitchen window with the seriousness of a small expert, beginning to make room in her understanding of the situation for something more complex than either pure condemnation or its opposite. He had been cruel, in the specific way that people are cruel when they stop seeing another person as a person with efficiency, with the detachment of someone closing a file rather than ending a life. He had stripped her of security while she was, unknowingly, carrying his child. He had walked away clean, and she had rebuilt from nothing. She would not pretend that was smaller than it was. But she had also watched him, in a Logan Square restaurant, hear the full accounting of what he had done, and accept it without deflecting, without explaining, without constructing the elaborate architecture of justification that most people built around their worst decisions. She had watched him sit with it. She had watched something in his face do what faces did when the weight of a thing landed on them without cushion. She was not ready to trust that. But she was not ready to dismiss it either. On day 22, a package arrived at her apartment. Small, wrapped in plain craft paper, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it standing in the hallway. It was a children's astronomy book, the kind with large illustrations, heavy pages, the text simple enough for a toddler, but the images detailed enough to hold genuine interest. On the inside cover, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, were 6 words. In case the stars come up. No signature. She stood in the hallway for a moment holding the book. Then she went inside and set it on the kitchen counter and did not call him because she needed to think about what the book meant and what the 30 days meant and what, if anything, came after the 30 days. And she needed to do that, thinking without his voice in her ear. She gave it to Mira that evening. Mira received it with the gravity she reserved for things she recognized as important, holding it carefully, opening the cover, looking at the first illustration of the solar system with the focused attention that meant she was filing information rather than simply consuming it. Stars, Mira said. Stars, Imara confirmed. This one. Mira pointed at the illustration of Saturn. It has rings. It does. Why? That's a very good question. Imara sat down beside her. What do you think? Mira considered this for a long moment. Maybe it needed them, she said finally, with the tone of someone who had provided the definitive answer and was ready to move on. Imara looked at her daughter's profile, the gray eyes, the set of the jaw that was entirely her own. Maybe it did, she said. Day 30 arrived. Imara added 2 days not out of cruelty, not as a test designed to fail, but because she had spent 4 years learning to be meticulous about terms, and the terms were hers to set, and setting them precisely was a form of self-respect she was no longer willing to negotiate away. She had said 30 days, meaning 30 days by her count, and her count ran to 32. She chose the park herself. A neighborhood park, 4 blocks from her apartment, not large, not architecturally significant, just a Chicago park in late December, with bare trees and cold benches, and a small open area where children ran in irregular orbits around each other, without apparent purpose or destination. She had brought Mira here dozens of times. She knew the bench that got the most afternoon light. She knew which stretch of path was most interesting to a toddler because it had a raised root system that functioned as an obstacle course. She told Mira they were going to the park to meet someone. Who? Mira asked, pulling on her red jacket with the single-minded focus she brought to clothing herself, which was a process she insisted on managing independently and which took considerably longer than the alternative. Someone I used to know, Imara said. Do I know them? Not yet. Mira considered this. Okay, she said, and went back to the jacket. Malcolm was already there when they arrived. He was standing 10 feet inside the park entrance, wearing a coat she didn't recognize, not his usual quality, something plainer, something that looked like a deliberate choice to not arrive as Malcolm Rhee, the way the world usually saw Malcolm Rhee. He had his hands in his pockets. He was not on his phone. He was just standing, in a park, in the December cold, waiting. He saw them from 20 feet. She watched his face do something she had very rarely seen it do, in 3 years of marriage, lose its composure entirely. Briefly, just for the moment between seeing them and reassembling. Not dramatically, just the careful, controlled surface of him, suddenly inadequate to what he was feeling, and the thing underneath it visible for 2 or 3 seconds before he pulled it back. He pulled it back. She walked toward him with Mira beside her. Mira gripping her hand in the specific way she gripped it when they were in a new situation, proprietary, the grip of a child who is assessing rather than afraid. They stopped. Malcolm looked at Mira. Mira looked at Malcolm. The look she gave him was the full attention version, both gray eyes. No social performance, the evaluation of a person who had not yet learned to pretend to be less perceptive than she was. She looked at his face with the same focused seriousness she'd applied to the astronomy book, the nuthatches, the Y-shaped stick. Then her attention moved to his eyes. She looked at them for a long moment. They're the same, she said. Malcolm's throat worked. His jaw held. His voice, when it came out, had cost him something. Yeah, he said. They are. Mira absorbed this without apparent surprise, which meant she had probably already noticed and had simply been waiting to have it confirmed. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the Y-shaped stick, which went everywhere with her, which had been in the pocket of the red jacket since October. She held it up in Malcolm's direction. This is my measuring stick, she said. I measure things with it. Malcolm looked at the stick with the careful seriousness it deserved. How does it work? Mira tilted her head. You just hold it and know. Know what? How big something is. She looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who was trying. You don't need numbers. Malcolm looked at the stick, then at Mira, then at the stick again, and something crossed his face that was not the accounting expression and not the recalibration expression, but something else. Entirely something that had no strategy in it, no calculation, no management of outcome. Just a man looking at his daughter's $3 Y-shaped stick like it was the most significant object he had ever been shown. Can I try? He said. Mira considered this for a moment. Then she handed it to him. He held it the way she held it, upright, extended slightly, directed at the park bench 10 feet away. He looked at the bench over the top of the stick. He held it for a long moment. "I think I know," he said. "How big?" Mira asked. "Big enough for 3 people," he said. They wanted to sit. Mira looked at the bench, looked back at him, gave a small, decisive nod, as if he had passed a test whose parameters he hadn't been informed of. Then she reached up and took the stick back and put it in her pocket and turned and walked toward the bench with the authority of a child who had made a decision and expected the world to follow. Imara looked at Malcolm. He looked at her. His eyes were doing the thing they had done when he stood in the venue at 11:50 unguarded, the composure present but thin, the thing underneath it visible to anyone paying attention. "Thank you," he said quietly. Oh, she held his gaze. "Don't thank me," she said. "Earn it." He nodded. Once, completely. They walked to the bench. The 3 of them sat in the December light, Mira in the middle, boots not quite reaching the ground. Gerald the elephant occupying her lap, alongside the astronomy book she had insisted on bringing because she wanted to show the bench the pictures of Saturn, which Imara had decided not to question. Mira opened the book to Saturn, held it up toward the park in general. "Rings," she announced. "Rings," Malcolm agreed. "It needed them," Mira said. Malcolm looked at the illustration. "Who told you that?" Mira pointed at Imara without looking up from the book. "Mama said maybe it needed them." "Mama's usually right," Malcolm said quietly. Imara looked at the bare trees across the park and said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. They sat for 40 minutes. Mira showed Malcolm every illustration in the astronomy book with the thorough dedication of a curator, guiding someone through a collection they didn't yet know how to appreciate. She explained which stars she considered important, a ranking system that appeared to be based on brightness and personal affinity rather than any astronomical classification. She identified, from memory and with complete confidence, the 3 bird species Kira had taught her, pointing at every tree in the park's vicinity as potential habitat. Malcolm listened to all of it, not with the polite attention of an adult performing interest in a child's monologue, with actual attention, the same quality of attention she had seen him give to financial reports and strategic assessments, and the 63 pages of a legal document he had prepared with meticulous care. He listened the way he listened to things that mattered. When Mira climbed off the bench to examine the raised root system on the path, Imara watched her go and felt Malcolm watching her too. "She's extraordinary," he said. "I know." Imara paused. "She came out that way. I can't take credit for the gray eyes, or the stubbornness, or the thing with the measuring stick. The stubbornness might be shared," he said. She almost smiled, decided against it, then let it happen anyway, small, controlled. Not a gift exactly, but an acknowledgement. "Might be," she said. They were quiet for a moment, watching Mira navigate the root system with her arms out for balance, and her face arranged in the expression of intense concentration that she wore, when a physical challenge had engaged her full investment. "I'm shutting things down," Malcolm said. She looked at him. "The parts that aren't legitimate," he said. "I've started already. He paused. "It costs. I knew it would. Territory, relationships, people who've been with me for a long time who aren't going to understand the direction." He paused again. "I'm not telling you for approval. I'm telling you because you should know what I'm doing." She considered this. How long? 2 years, maybe. To do it cleanly enough that it doesn't leave damage behind it. And what does that look like for Mira? "A trust," he said. "Legally independent. Not connected to the organization. Something she can access when she's an adult without it coming attached to anything she didn't choose." Imara was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare trees. Mira had found a stick, a different stick, not Y-shaped, longer, which she was now using to trace something in the frost at the edge of the path. "She's not going to inherit anything that comes from fear," Imara said. "I don't care how it's structured on paper." "I know," Malcolm said. "That's why I'm 2 years into changing what it comes from." She turned and looked at him directly. He held the look. In 3 years of marriage, she had looked at this face, across dinner tables, and in conference rooms, and in the flat light of early morning, and in the composed stillness of a man who was always somewhere slightly behind his own expression. She had spent 4 years after the marriage learning to stop looking for it. She was looking at it now and finding something she hadn't expected. Not redemption, she was not naive enough to call it that, and she wasn't sure the word meant anything useful in the practical architecture of real lives. Not absolution, not the end of the accounting. Just a man, sitting on a park bench in December, watching his daughter trace patterns in the frost, choosing with the deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what it cost to become something other than what he had been. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Not close to yet. But it was a beginning. Mira came back to the bent bench at a run, which was her standard speed for return trips, and inserted herself back into the middle with the authority of someone reclaiming their established position. "I found another stick," she announced, holding up the longer one. "This one is for measuring big things." "What counts as big?" Malcolm asked. Mira looked around the park. She pointed at the tree nearest the bench, old, large, its bare branches spreading in complicated directions. "That," she said. "How big do you think it is?" Malcolm asked. Mira took her new stick and held it up toward the tree with both hands, her tongue between her teeth, her gray eyes narrowed in the specific way they narrowed when she was applying her full assessment capability to a problem. She held the position for a long moment. "Very," she said finally. "But it's been here a long time, so it had time to get that way." Malcolm looked at the tree for a moment. "That's true," he said. "Things that take a long time are usually bigger," Mira added, with the conclusive tone of someone articulating a philosophy they had already fully developed and were now simply sharing with the less informed. Imara looked at her daughter, at the gray eyes and the measuring stick and the red jacket and the complete unself-conscious authority of a person who had arrived in the world 3 years ago with nothing except herself, and had decided, without anyone teaching her, that herself was enough to start with. She thought about a floral couch and a water-stained fox on a ceiling, about Felipe's kitchen and the smell of burned carrots and Reina's handwriting on a corrected inventory sheet, about a laundromat railing in the freezing rain and a pregnancy test in a gas station bathroom and 19 hours of labor and a nurse named Dorothea who had called her baby and meant it, about 63 pages and a conference table and a wedding ring beside an untouched glass of whiskey, about a yellow cake that had tasted like care. She had built something from all of that. From the cold and the closed doors, and the empty father line on a birth certificate, and the $4 cupcake order from the 3rd floor, and every exhausted morning that had not been allowed to be the end of it. She had built it without permission and without a safety net, and without anyone handing her the materials, built it in the margins of other people's schedules, and with money she'd held in her hand at the end of the same day she'd earned it, built it until it had a name and a reputation and a contract and staff and a waiting list and a room she could stand in at the end of the hardest 6 days of her life and know that everything in it had come from her. She was not done building. That was the part nobody told you about surviving, that it didn't end with one thing one night, one conversation on a park bench. It kept going. The morning after the hardest thing was still a morning that required coffee and a plan and the willingness to begin again. And the morning after that was the same, and that was not a diminishment of what had been endured, but the actual shape of a life. It continued, and you continued in it, and the continuing was the point. 2 years later, the morning broke gray over Chicago. Imara stood outside Solenne's first permanent building, holding a coffee cup with both hands, the heat of it moving into her fingers against the November air. The building's exterior was plain. She had not put resources into the facade, had put them into the kitchen instead, into the equipment and the ventilation and the training room on the 2nd floor, where 6 women were already inside, beginning the morning session. 6 had become 12, and 12 had become a waiting list, and the waiting list had names on it that Imara kept on a physical sheet of paper rather than a spreadsheet, because she wanted to see them written in actual handwriting, wanted to feel the weight of each name as a person rather than a data point. Reina ran the training program. She had wanted to, from the beginning had asked for it in the specific way. Reina asked for things she wanted, which was directly and without apology. "I want to build this part. Let me build it." Imara had let her. It was, in her estimation, the best decision she had made in 2 years, because Reina had built it into something neither of them had fully imagined, rigorous and practical and specific, program that taught women the exact things that could not be found in culinary school or small business seminars. How to read a contract so that the dangerous clauses were visible, how to price work so that the number reflected its actual value, and not the fear of asking for more, how to build independence before comfort, and how to recognize, in real time, the difference between being needed and being valued. Mira stood beside her on the sidewalk in a new red jacket. The old one had finally been retired after 2 years of hard service holdings, Gerald the elephant in one arm and the astronomy book in the other. The astronomy book was battered now, its corners soft from handling, 2 of its pages repaired with tape by careful hands. Mira could identify every planet from memory and had opinions about most of them. She was 4 years old. Her gray eyes missed nothing. A car stopped down the block. Mira saw it before Imara did. She had always been faster to notice arrivals, had some animal alertness to changes in the environment that Imara came from the same place as the measuring stick and the bird identification, from whatever it was in her that arrived, already oriented toward the world's specific details. "He's here," Mira said, with the flat satisfaction of a confirmed expectation. Malcolm stepped out of the car. He was wearing something ordinary, a dark coat, nothing significant, the kind of clothing that had no message in it. He had Saturdays now, and some Sunday mornings, and the Tuesday afternoon routine that Mira had come to expect, with the unquestioned certainty she extended to things that had been reliable long enough to become structural. He showed up when he said he would. When he couldn't, he called Imara 2 days in advance, not the morning of, not the night before, 2 days, which gave Mira's expectations time to adjust, rather than simply failing to be met. He brought no jewelry, no extravagant gestures. He had once arrived with an astronomy poster for Mira's room that he had found in an actual museum gift shop, which told Imara he had been in an actual museum gift shop, which told her something she'd had to sit with for a while. He remembered, without being reminded, that Mira disliked the texture of certain fabrics, that she wanted her sandwiches cut diagonally rather than straight, that she had a specific way she needed a story read to her, with full voices for each character, no skipping, regardless of how long the book was. He listened when she spoke. That was the thing Imara noticed most. The same quality of attention she had seen him give to financial instruments and strategic assessments, he gave to a 4-year-old's description of a dream she'd had about whales. Complete attention, no phone, no drift, just presence. The expensive, simple currency of a person who had decided that this was what mattered now. She had not forgiven him completely. She thought perhaps she might, eventually. Not as a restoration of what had been. What had been was not something she wanted restored. Not the penthouse, or the security apparatus, or the marriage that had operated like a business arrangement with occasional warmth, but as the private internal process of setting down a weight she'd been carrying for long. Enough that she had stopped noticing it as a weight. She was not there yet. She was not pretending to be. But she was no longer angry in the consuming way she had once been angry. The anger had metabolized into something more useful, a clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it had cost and what she had built in the space left by the cost, which was substantial enough that she did not need the anger anymore to remind her of her own worth. She knew her worth. She had been paying herself according to it for 4 years. Mira had already left the sidewalk by the time Malcolm reached them, closing the distance between herself and him in the unself-confront of a child who had decided someone was safe and acted accordingly. Gerald bouncing against her side. Malcolm crouched before she reached him, not to make himself smaller, though he was doing that, but in the way she had watched him do it every Saturday. For 2 years, the gesture of a man who had decided that getting to eye level with his daughter was worth whatever it cost his knees on cold pavement. Mira arrived at speed, stopped just short, looked at him. "I found a new bird," she said immediately. "Tell me," told him. In considerable detail, with her hands involved in the description and her gray eyes serious, and her voice carrying the authority of a person reporting a significant discovery to someone she expected to understand its significance. He listened to all of it. Imara watched from the sidewalk with her coffee, and the November air, and the building behind her that bore her company's name. Watched her daughter explain a bird to the man who had once looked at her mother across a conference table with nothing in his face, and she felt something settle in her chest, that she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to feel. Not completion, she didn't believe in that. The tidy resolution of complexity into peace. Life was not structured that way. Tomorrow there would be contracts and logistics, and the waiting list, and the training program, and the next event, and the negotiation of two adults raising a child together across the distance of what they had failed to be to each other. It would be difficult sometimes. It would require things of her she didn't always want to give. It would require her to make room, carefully and deliberately, and on her own terms, for a person she had every reason not to make room for. But Mira would grow up knowing both of them. She would grow up in a building that bore her mother's name, with a measuring stick in her pocket and an astronomy book in her hands, in a city that her mother had walked 9 blocks through freezing rain to survive. Understanding what had been built and what it had cost, and that the cost had been worth paying, because she, Mira, gray-eyed and stubborn, and completely herself, was what the building was for. She would inherit neither kingdom nor suffering. She would inherit the freedom made in the space between what one person had finally chosen to dismantle and what another had refused to stop building. Imara drank the last of her coffee. The morning continued its ordinary, sufficient work, and the table, as it had always been, remained hers.